the Texas Revolution. The fighting of the Texas Revolution. The Texas Revolution, I think, really begins in Anahuac in 1832. However, you will start to see regular and concerted fighting in the Revolutionary era in 1835, especially in the fall of 1835. When we talk about the Texas Revolution and we talk about this combat, it is fair to remember that you're going to have two principal armies in the field. Now, they don't. One army is more of a hodgepodge of individuals, and that would be the Army of the People. The Texian Army of the People is a hodgepodge. It is a problematic. It is a problematic army. Army of the People. Typing that in. So there you go. And I believe I touched on the Army of the People last time. Is that about right? So when we get them and we find them in the field over outside of Bexar in 1835. Now we're looking in November of 1835. The Army of the People has got some major problems. First of all, highly ill-disciplined. For example, here, put this event in your notes. I've mentioned already the Concepcion fight in the last lecture. Mission Concepcion, there was a shootout there, and you found out how bad the Mexican gunpowder was because bullets kept bouncing off of the chest of the Texians when they'd get shot. The second battle, and this one also demonstrates how ill-disciplined the Texian army could be, happens outside of San Antonio as well. Somewhere, best I can tell geographically, somewhere on the southwest side of town, today's San Antonio, southwest of downtown, like you're heading down I-35 toward Pearsall and Laredo sort of thing. Obviously not all the way to the river, and really just outside of town. But it's called the Grass Fight. That's the event, the Grass Fight. The Grass Fight sounds almost comical. I mean, it sounds almost like there was some sort of two factions because Texas, it never snows. You decided to get in a fight over with, instead of snowballs, you used grass. I mean, but that's not what happens. It's in 35, November of 35. 1835? 1835. The thing is that when we talk about this grass fight outside of Bexar, just the southwest side of town in today's San Antonio. Bexar and San Antonio are the same place. But what you find there is a rumor that ran rampant through the Texian Army of the People. And that rumor is that the Mexicans had sent gold trains up to Bexar to pay the soldados and pay the officers that were holding Bexar and the Alamo. The Alamo by 1835 and the Alamo by November of 1835 is clearly being set up and being used as a fortification. First by the Mexicans, and actually to be clear about it, first at times by the Spaniards. The name the Alamo comes from the Spanish era, and it comes from a cavalry outfit that was housed there called the Alamo de Parras. But the thing is that the Mexicans used the Alamo first in the Texas Revolution. But they are also defending the town Bexar, which is just to the west of the Alamo. Anyways, the rumor is that those soldados, those officers in the Mexican army, were getting ready to be paid in gold and silver, and the Mexican army had sent a gold train up to Bexar. The Texians believed it. Many Texians, to be clear about this, many Texians are of the opinion that they were in it for the money. A lot of Texians are fighting for independence, perhaps, some fighting to fight, and then others fighting to get rich. There's never been anything unusual about that. Men have taken up arms for many reasons over the long history of man. But what happens is that a disciplined army does not disintegrate and go running after a rumor that says there's gold to be had on this money train coming up out of Mexico. Well, what did they find? They found a train of horses. They found a train of oxen. They found a train of mules. The Mexican army had, in fact, come up and had come out of Bexar. But that money train was no money train at all. When they drove off the Mexicans and they drove off the soldados and captured that money train, what they found in there was grass. What they found in there was fodder. Meaning the Mexicans meaning the Mexican army in San Antonio de Bexar are having trouble feeding their horses. They're having trouble feeding their oxen. or their pack animals, or any sort of animal that they would use either for food or for drafting purposes. What it should have told the Texians is their siege was working. However, it disappointed many Texians that they weren't getting what they thought they should have been getting. They were disappointed they didn't get rich. So by the time you get to basically December 3rd and 4th, worth noting is that Stephen F. Austin, who had been the original commander of this Army of the People, Stephen F. Austin had left. Stephen F. Austin was a lot of things. A good general was not one of them. He could command the respect of these rough-hewn frontiersmen, but he did not command their respect forever. Well, the man who replaces Austin outside of Bexar, and this man's name, as I might have said last time, was Edward Burleson. Edward Burleson is the namesake of my home county. Burleson was a Texas Ranger. He was an Indian fighter, a frontiersman, a surveyor. And if you ever look at a picture of Burleson, and in fact, actually, if you got a moment, I'll keep lecturing, but if you've got a moment, look him up. Edward Burleson. Let me type that in if you need me to spell it for you. Burleson, it's really just as it sounds, or just like the town up in North Texas. But if you look at Burleson, there's only one daguerreotype of him that has been done, and the others are okay portraits. But that was Burleson late in life, and you can kind of see him cock his head, and he's looking at that camera, and he's basically got a determination. I really don't want this done, but my daughters have made me. And that was what had happened. Their daughters had made him take a picture, and he died a few months later. But Burleson had this fierceness about him that a lot of men, a lot of frontiersmen would follow. General Burleson, however, in early December 1835, has got a problem. That Texian army of the people is disintegrating. That Texian army of the people is going home. Many of them came to fight. They did not come to besiege. They were receiving letters from family that said, "Come home, dear. I need you. Come home. I want you to be home with me. Please help." And so many of them were leaving. So the Texian army was fading away, and the siege was up. And so Burleson had determined to lift the siege, and he sent word to his men, "Pack up, boys, we're going home." And, as I said last time, Ben Milam steps forward. And Ben Milam's an old adventurer in Texas. He's an old, what you might call in your notes, a filibusterer at times. You will find him intriguing in Texas and in Mexico. And Milam, who was in his early 50s, if my memory is correct, Milam had escaped out of a Mexican jail at Matamoros and had fled to Texas prior to in early 1835. But Ben Milam was pissed off, and he and Burleson commenced a shouting match and a cuss fight in Burleson's tent, and Milam steps out and says famously, "Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" And the next morning, the battle begins. The next morning, in the pre-dawn hours of December 5th, 1835, the Texian army, what was left of it, those who willingly went into and fought at Bexar, went into and proceeded the assault on the city or town of Bexar, or San Antonio to us. It was a hard-fought affair. Some names that you ought to remember, one of which should pop right out at you because some of you come from South Texas. Down in South Texas, it's really on the way to Corpus Christi in a sense. There's a county called Karnes County. There's Karnes City, Kennedy, Sestahova, Pavelicville, and so on. Down there southeast of San Antonio on the way to Corpus Christi or Rockport, Karnes County is the namesake for a man named Henry Wax Karnes. Henry Wax Karnes. Karnes is a young man. He's not much older than y'all are, in his mid-20s basically. But Karnes was a tracker. He was an adventurer. He was a young man who's got a lot of piss and vinegar, to use a crude term. The thing is that that man also was redheaded. And I don't remember if I said this to y'all before, but, like Wells. Wells is redheaded right now, it looks like, I think. The thing is that had Wells, or for that matter, which happened to Henry Wax Karnes, get captured by the Comanche would try to wash your hair out and put the fire out on your head. I kid you not. The thing, though, is that had the Army of the People been handing out medals of honors and silver stars and medals for valor, Karnes, during the battles at Bexar, the battle for Bexar, he probably would have won several medals because of his valor and his accolades, or actions rather. Later on, worth noting, he and Deaf Smith, whom I believe I mentioned to you in the last lecture, Deaf Smith, or Erastus Deaf Smith, Deaf Smith are going to become some of the great scouts for that Texian army as they retreat towards San Jacinto later in the war. But the Battle of Bexar is a slow but steady affair. Ben Milam does not survive it. He gets shot in the head a couple of days into the battles for Bexar. He gets shot in the head by a sniper in some cypress trees along the banks of the San Antonio River. Drilled him in the forehead and he fell over dead. So Ben Milam dies into the battle. But the Texians slowly but surely sweep Bexar out, and they clear Bexar of the Mexicans. And then they surround the Alamo. And this, at this point in time, should have been a lesson to the Texians, but they missed the lesson. What's the great thing about being in a fort? Well, you're in a fort, you're protected. What's the bad thing about being in a fort? If you're surrounded and you don't have inexhaustible supplies of water and food and enough manpower to defend your territory, you're kind of stuck. You're like a crab in a bucket or something like that. But the thing is that the Mexicans were pinned in the Alamo, and by December 9th, they surrender. Well, the Texians were not going to execute the Mexicans. They sometimes would threaten it, but the idea of just a mass slaughter did not occur. In fact, actually, what ends up happening is Burleson and a couple of other Texians negotiate surrender terms for the Mexicans, led by a man at Bexar named Martin Perfecto de Cos. General Cos is told basically that you can leave Texas and promise never to come back, and all will be fine. All will be fine. But this is a dangerous moment. And this is a dangerous omen, not just dangerous, but a serious omen for the Texian Revolution. How far do you go and how far do you press this thing? Because, write this down, even as late as 1835 and into 1836, the Texian population, especially the Anglo population, is still kind of divided over the issue of independence. The Tejano population of Texas at this point in time is largely opposed to independence. And in fact, many Tejanos, put this in your notes too, many Tejanos are opposed not just to Texas independence from Mexico, but many Tejanos in Texas are opposed to independence from Coahuila. If you remember in those short little videos, one of the recurring themes that keeps popping up is independence from Coahuila. Texas was attached to Coahuila, that other Mexican state. The reason the Tejanos would be opposed to independence from Coahuila, at least some Tejanos were anyways, is because they feared, and rightly so, that once that happened and Texas became its own state in Mexico, if that's what ends up playing out, because they don't know it's going to happen in 1836, that Texas would be a predominantly, by far, Anglo state in Mexico, and the Tejano interest would be outvoted and be overrun by the Anglos. So there is all these background and political things working. So I want you to understand that most people in Texas are conflicted about independence. Now, one of the groups that you come across, and we'll have to watch a little bit more on the video, but they're called the War Dogs, or the War Party. Those boys, they had no conflict in their heart about what should happen. They were in favor of independence from Mexico. That's what they thought Texas should do. In the interim period between December of 1835 and now to February of 1836, moving our story along, the thing is that one thing you should note, and you really need to pay, I probably come at you with a question or two about this on exam 4, is that the Texian government is a mess. The Texian government is a mess. Whether it's a provisional state government or a provisional ad interim is the term that they use, national government like the Republic of Texas, the factions are so fierce in Texas politics at that time period that they butt heads seemingly all day long. Well, that's going to help disorganize the Texas Revolution even more. So the reason I bring up the year or the month February of 1836 is because you're going to see Texian military men start to repopulate San Antonio de Bexar. One of the individuals who goes to Bexar to defend it is William Barrett Travis. William Barrett Travis. Now, William Barrett Travis is no more than you are. Like I said last time, he's about 25 years old or so at this point in his life, actually 26. And he is a rambunctious war party advocate, and worth noting, too, he is a member of the regular army. He's a member of the... Travis, like Travis County. Travis County. William Barrett Travis is going to go to Bexar, and his assignment was to essentially fortify and to hold Bexar. And Travis goes to Bexar with about 30 or 40 men. They're cavalrymen for the most part, and so Travis, as the story goes, fought the posting. Travis, as the story goes, was not in favor of going to Bexar. A cavalryman, which means a horse rider or a horse master, does not generally want to get into a fort. A horseman does not want to generally hold up in a city. He'd rather be out on the plains, or he'd rather be on the back of a horse, affecting his military calling. Well, the problem is that that's what he's supposed to do. Now, the thing is, at least notionally, the commander of the Texian army is Sam Houston. Write that down. The commander of the Texian army is Sam Houston. And Sam Houston does not want to hold San Antonio to Bexar. Sam Houston wants to abandon Bexar. And so you have, and this is one of the problems the Texians are going to have, is the Texian command structure is so jumbled up. You have a commanding officer who is of the regular army, and believe me, there's going to be more to the story in a second. The regular army, the Texian regular army, the commanding officer by February of 36 is Houston. He wants to get rid of the Alamo, or hang on a second, Juan. Houston, who is, he's not in, so I'll be clear about this. Houston is not in Bexar. Houston is back in either San Felipe, or he's in Gonzales, or he's in Bastrop, or Minnows. It was in, and even in Nacogdoches, he runs up East Texas. You'll find Houston everywhere. Oh, and Washington on the Brazos, where the Declaration is getting ready to be put out in March. So you find Houston all over the place in February of 36, mostly actually at Washington on the Brazos. But Houston wants the Alamo destroyed. Get rid of it, blow it up, pull the cannon out of the Alamo. We can't hold that thing. And by the way Houston conceived of it is that the Alamo was of little strategic importance. Please put that in your notes. We talk about this in a military sense. The Alamo isn't that important. Now, you think, well, wasn't there a great battle there? If you remember back to 7th grade history, and people make a big deal about it. You have an Alamo Bowl. You have the Alamo Dome. Remember the Alamo. You know, everybody says, makes a big deal about the Alamo, but the building itself, or the fortification itself, was rickety at best. In fact, actually partially crumbling. The north wall of the Alamo was in ruins. There was a part between what if you've been to the Alamo, and most of you probably have, on some trip, whether it's family or school, to it. What you see as the Alamo today is really all that was the chapel, the church that the mission had. But if you're looking at the front wall, or the front face of the Alamo in 2020, to the right side of that front face of the chapel, from there going about 50 feet, no, excuse me, about 100 feet, maybe 150 feet, is just an open hole. I'm trying to tell you is that the Alamo was a death trap. You get in there, you could get yourself killed rather quickly. Secondly, how do forts work? How do forts become successful and effective in fighting military battles? How do they help hold territory? Well, for example, using West Point in New York as an example, the United States Military Academy at West Point is sitting in an old fortification. That fortification and the forts around West Point sit on some high bluffs, and they cannot be easily gotten to, and they point down into the river, and they control that river, which is the Hudson River. If you think to the Alamo, does it control a river, a navigable river? The Alamo controls no navigable river. Can you go around the Alamo? Easily. Does the Alamo protect Bexar? Not really. So if I was to say like this, Does the Alamo protect anything other than itself? The answer would be, frankly, no. The Alamo only protects the ground that it has. There is no, never say it a little differently, there is no strategic importance for the Alamo itself in a military sense. None. None. Yet, Travis, who is an impetuous young man, sees it as something that has to be held. And so he stays, violating orders. Then, General Sam Houston, who is, like I said, mostly in Washington on the Brazos, but you will find him in East Texas at times, there in the late winter of 36. Houston is going to send James Bowie, old Bowie, down to Bexar to blow the fort up and to get the stuff out, and Bowie disregards orders. Now, James Bowie, Travis I've already given a little talk about, but let's talk about Bowie for a second. Now, Bowie is a noteworthy man, and maybe some of you on this Zoom call enjoy guns, but others maybe on the Zoom call have an interest in knives, maybe switchblades. I think they're legal in Texas nowadays, actually. The thing is that maybe a butterfly knife. But anybody have a Bowie knife about yay big? And William's shaking his head, yep, I've got one. I mean, when I was y'all's age, I wanted one and I bought one. It was a piece of junk, frankly, because it's not that, the metal on it's not that good, or the steel on it's not that good. But the Bowie knife bears the name. The Bowie knife itself, as far as a fighting knife is concerned, or a hunting knife, the Bowie knife is given to James by his brother Reason Bowie. James Bowie was a celebrity. Please note that already. James Bowie is a celebrity prior to the Alamo. He had been caught up in what's called the sandbar fight in around Natchez, Mississippi. Earlier in the decade, he had come to Texas after he had tried to essentially steal a portion of southwestern Louisiana. If you've been down to Lake Charles, down around that part of Louisiana, that's the part of Louisiana Bowie tried to steal. Bowie was also a slave trader, illegally so. He conspired with pirates to pull that off. Jean Lafitte, who circulated in the western Gulf of Mexico, was his friend. And last but not least, James Bowie. Worth noting, James Bowie is going to marry into a very prominent Tejano family in Bexar, the Veramendes. And it didn't hurt anything that they were prominent, and Bowie, I think, loved the woman, but at the same time, it didn't hurt a bit that Ursula was a wealthy young woman. Bowie was, to be clear about this, he's a bit of a con man. I think you ought to use that term, or a swindler. I know that's kind of harsh to say, and some of you may be thinking I shouldn't say it like that, but his life is really checkered. It is really checkered. However, I do want to say this. Because Bowie's got his faults. Bowie, however, is about as good of a friend as one could have. Bowie is about as good of a friend as anybody could wish for. Let's say if William was a friend of was a friend of James Bowie's, and William found himself in a tight spot. Bowie, if that man decided to fight for you, God help the other people who are fighting against you. Bowie was that sort of man. In a tight spot, people naturally flock to him. I think you ought to remember that. That man is charismatic. He's got a way with words. He is a great storyteller. People find him funny. He's a bit of a braggart. The Mexicans, particularly interior Mexicans, referred to him as Fanfarron Santiago, that braggart James. That's what they called him. But people still flocked to him, even if they knew he was a little bit shady. Oh, and by the way, one last thing, he loved a good drink, suffered from a lot of different illnesses, and one last thing, he loved to sing Mexican Methodist hymns. Loved to sing Methodist hymns, though he never went to church. So, James Bowie is the leader of the volunteers at the Alamo. The volunteers at the Alamo. So you have these two factions in the Texas Revolution, the regular army on the one hand that's disobedient to its general, and the volunteers, which is disobedient to its not general, and they are trying to hold the Alamo against very large odds. And oh, by the way, many Texians think the Mexicans are not going to come back to Texas until the summertime. Because one of the things that has sometimes been poo-pooed in Texas history is that Santana will force, Antonio Lopez de Santana will force his army of operations to march through the snow. You need to remember that. It is absolutely true that the Mexican army will march through the snow in northern Mexico to get to Texas by February 23rd, 1836. You think it didn't snow there? It's the worst winter in the history of the Sierra Madre. But he marched them through there. And so here we are at the Alamo. The February of 1836, many Texians don't think anything's going to happen. If they do, it won't be for a while. There is factionalism between the units and so on. It's a mess. And J.C. Neal, who should have been in command, he goes off to take care of business over at Bastrop, which is his home, until the Mexican army shows up. Put this name in your notes. It's the Army of Operations. The Army of Operations is the Mexican army. The Army of Operations is about as unwieldy and at times as disorganized as the Texian Army of the People. The Mexican Army of Operations is really going to be split into two parts when it's all said and done. It's going to be split into two parts. One is going to go up El Camino Real and take them to Bexar and points beyond. So you've got that right there. El Camino Real is going to be one of the major arteries into Texas during the Revolution. The other one is the La Bahia Trace, or the Goliad Road, sometimes called. If you want to think of it as, say, Highway 59. If you've been down Highway 59, which I think in Houston is what the Southwest Freeway, something like that. But anyways, in Houston, it runs by Joel Osteen's megachurch and then shoots out toward Sugar Land and eventually Victoria and so on. That's the route they take. This other unit is going to take, it's led by a guy named Jose Urrea. But to the Army of Operations, I want to give you a few pieces of information for your notes. The Army of Operations is made up of men and women. Please make note of that. It's made up of men and women. But the Army of Operations is chronically short on supplies. The Army of Operations is chronically short of clothing, it's chronically short of shoes, chronically short of food, chronically short of medical care, whether that's in the form of doctors, nurses, or any medicine for the era. Water. They almost die of thirst out in the middle of the desert after crossing out of the mountains. This Army of Operations is a mess. And part of the reason is
Would you consider an army at that point?
Yeah, it's an army. Don't worry. They've got enough uniforms to be called that. But the Army of Operations clearly has got problems. One of which is its wagons. Let's call them Teamsters in your notes. Teamsters. Let me write that into the chat. Teamsters. Some of you are familiar with the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters Union is a truck drivers union today. But if you actually, unless they've changed their logo, and I haven't seen it in a while, the Teamsters used to have in the United States a logo that had a wagon wheel with a couple of horse heads on it. It's an allusion to their history. But the Teamsters aren't unique to the United States. Every nation's had some form of Teamsters, just depends on what they call them. In Mexico, the Teamsters don't trust the Mexican government. Please put that in your notes. When the Mexican government puts together, Santana more particularly, puts together the Teamsters and this Army of Operation, he needs people to drive his mules and drive his wagons to Texas. They hire the Teamsters. The Teamsters had a bad history with Mexico and its government that the Teamsters said, you got to pay us up front, and you pay us for every mile we go up front. Otherwise, you're not going to pay us. You've stiffed us before. Speaking to the government. And so Santana said, sure, I'll pay you. But somewhere in the mountains, basically, as the story goes, the Teamsters walked off the job and went back to Mexico City because they hadn't been paid. So guess what? Wells, you made the remark just a second ago, they haven't changed it. Congratulations, Wells. You get to be a mule skinner, a horse driver. I'm guessing you've never done that before. Well, you got to do it now. It's just what we do. So the army bogs down. They try to beat their mules to death, and that doesn't work normally. Then they don't have any money to pay anybody except for Santana and a few of the generals. And what money they do have, put this in your notes, is borrowed from the Catholic Church at about a 20% interest rate. And you're thinking, why on earth did the Catholic Church try to skin them on the interest rate? Well, it's because the Mexican government had borrowed money before, years before, and then didn't pay back the loan. So, and last part here, I brought up the issue about women, and you may be thinking, well, that's nice, that's good equality. I don't know. And it's the reason I say this, not because the women are going to take up arms and be infantrymen or infantrywomen. They're not. They're called soldaderas. And it goes, actually, it's an old practice, goes back to Spain. Soldadera. I misspelled it. I can see it. Well, sometimes you see things and you... there we go. Anyways, the soldaderas, they're the women. Say the mothers or the sisters or most likely the wives of these men. And so these soldaderas, they travel with the army. They make up at least a quarter of the army and maybe closer to a third of it. So here's the question I pose to you, and you can type it in the chat bar. Why on earth, if you're running short on supplies and you're running short on water, and like I said, they almost die of thirst before they get to the Rio Grande, and they've got problems galore, why on earth don't they send the soldaderas home? Because they are a drag on the army. I mean, they play the role. Juan says morale, that's part of it. But even more fundamental than that, in a sense, what happens if the soldaderas go home? What happens? Well, the answer is going to be basically, well, the men are going to go home. Because the thinking was, yeah, the soldiers go home, they march home. The thinking was at least half of the men would say, I ain't going to go on campaign in Texas without my wife. And so they have to take them. So when you see the battle for the Alamo in March, late February, early March of 1836, there's going to be a lot of women along in the Mexican camp, and those are the soldaderas. So anyways, they show up. The Mexican army gets to San Antonio earlier than expected, and it surprises the Texians and catches them completely unawares. When it's all said and done, and I'm going to kind of push the story and the narrative of the Alamo along a little bit, but when it's all said and done, there are no more than about 187, put that number in your notes, no more than about 187 Texians, mostly Anglo-Texians, some Tejanos, but there's no more than 187 Texians in the Alamo. It's not a big force. Outside of the Alamo, there are thousands, several thousand Mexican soldados. It is a 10-to-1 or a 20-to-1 situation out there. But the Texians, who are now trapped in the Alamo, starting in February 23rd of 1836, going all the way to March 6th, 1836, when the fall happens, the Texians at least can fight back. They have good rifles. However, even more importantly, they've got good artillery. The Alamo did have some good cannon in it, and that's worth noting right there. So if the Mexicans decide to storm the Alamo, it's going to cost them and cost them dearly. And ultimately, the Mexicans, of course, Santana's calling the shots, the Mexicans will storm the Alamo and push and go in on the morning of March 6, 1836. One of the things that's worth remembering about old Buck Travis is that he was a great writer. He was actually kind of a lot like, I would say, a lot like old, not Patrick Henry, what's that guy's name in the American Revolution? Thomas Paine, Tom Paine. In the sense that you read Travis, he had a flair for using the English language to motivate. Famously, in the Texas Revolution, Travis is going to write this letter that ends with liberty or death. I will do what is owed my country. It's the Travis letter. It's written on about the 24th of February. And very dramatic. I've even seen it read in certain circles, too, in the last 10 years, sort of thing. This is the Travis letter. One of the things that you get the impression of, especially in that horrible movie, that comedy, called of John Wayne's The Alamo, is that you get the impression that these guys, whether it's Bowie, who's in there as well, Travis, or David Crockett, who's also in there, or the many others whom we know, but we don't have time to go through in the survey, you get the impression almost that they're all looking forward to dying. They're all excited. Yay, I'm going to die today. They're not. They're not. What you find out, if you really start to look at the Alamo, is that especially as you get closer and closer to March 6, 1836, you start to see the disappointment that nobody's coming to their aid, and you see them starting to become resigned to the fact that they're going to meet their end rather soon. Some of those kids in there are no more than y'all's age, and they don't have a future anymore. Some of those guys in there are older, more closer to my age, and there is no more future. And so there becomes a resignation. You even see a little bit of bitterness in Travis's last letters out of the Alamo in 1836. Bowie, by the way, is a sick man. In fact, he's a dying man. Bowie, as I'm telling the story, I'm 43 right now. Bowie is all of about 39. I'm a little older than he is. Bowie, at this point in time, is suffering from a lot of problems. Tuberculosis, perhaps, cholera. Consumption and tuberculosis are the same things. He may have galloping pneumonia, maybe some other illness. But Bowie collapses in the Alamo shortly after the siege begins, and he's more or less comatose, or at least in delirium for most of the siege. Good chances he was dead by the time the battle took place. If he wasn't, he was on death's doorstep. But the Texians, they're outnumbered, and they know it. Now, let me shift my teaching of this Alamo business to the Mexicans, to the Army of Operations. Every night, after the Mexicans surround the Alamo and finally pinch off the siege and pinch off the escape routes and basically encircle the Alamo, every night the Mexican army is going to serenade the Texians in that fortification. And every night they play him a song. And that song is called Degüello. Degüello. You'll hear it played different ways. I guess like anything, you can, those of you who know music, you can rearrange anything and make it swing or slow it down or pick it up or change the key or whatever. The thing is that the way you hear it sometimes is more like a jaunty, almost John Philip Sousa march. And it is a cavalry thing. It is a cavalry march. But you can play it in a minor key and it just comes out almost like, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to do it slowly. You're all going to die. The thing is that when you hear Degüello, the Mexicans got it from the Spaniards, and the Spaniards got it from the Moors. So it's got a long history. It goes back into the old country. And Degüello means slit throat. Every night, the Texians are sang to sleep, as it were, by slit throat. Slit throat. Oh, and there's also a red banner flying over top of the San Fernando Church, not cathedral at that point in time, and it says, "Death to traitors." And every night, on that 13-day siege, the Mexican Army of Operations bombards the Alamo, lobs cannonballs, some of explosive nature, others of solid shot. But they lob them into the Alamo every night to keep the Texians awake. These soldiers, these citizen soldiers, these Texians, they're going to be awake for the most part for the next, from the start of the siege to the fall of the Alamo. They're going to be awake for the better part of about 13 days straight. The Texians know what's coming. The Mexicans know what's coming. But the question is, does Santana send his boys, send his soldados over the top? Does he send them into the Alamo before they knock the walls down? See, the best thing to understand about a guy like Antonio Lopez de Santana is that he's for himself. I think if you were to write, and I've told it various ways over the years as I've taught this, but Antonio Lopez is a fascinating man, and he's not a good man, but he's fascinating to me as a historical figure. He's a madcap. What I mean by a madcap, you can look that up, but basically he's rash, he's completely self-centered. In fact, actually, a womanizer of the First Order. While he was at Bexar waiting to sack the Alamo, he marries a girl. Did I tell y'all that story before? Or have y'all heard that before? Anyways, there's a Bejarina, a young woman. She's about y'all's age, ladies, 18, 20 territory. Santana's about my age at this point in time, about 42. Anyways, the way the story goes is Santana sees this woman, this young girl, young woman, and basically wants to get to know her in a biblical sense. And when we talk about Santana, he sent word to the family and said, I'd like to meet your daughter and have her stay with me for a few days. And the family said, no, you can't. To Santana, the Bejarino family said, you can't have her. You have to marry her first. And so Santana said, sure, I'll marry her. They had a full Catholic marriage sacrament event there at the San Fernando church. This girl thought she was marrying Santana, the president of Mexico, the dictator of Mexico in some respects. And then after the Battle of the Alamo and after Santana leaves Bejar to chase after the Texians in April, late March, early April of 36, Santana says to his new wife, and this is after they'd consummated the marriage quite a bit, he says to her, by the way, I'm not married to you. The priest who married us is that guy right there, and he's on my staff. He's not a Catholic priest. And oh, by the way, you're going to be moving to Saltillo. It may have been Monterrey, actually. You're moving to Monterrey, and you're going to become a nun. So this is the sort of man we're talking about with Santana. He's completely self-absorbed. And he cares for really only one person, and that's himself. But he's mercurial is the best way I could describe him in some respects. The reason I bring all that up is that had Santana waited just a couple of days, in fact, actually less than 48 hours, his heavy artillery would have knocked the walls of the Alamo down. And those Mexican soldados could have just walked over the rubble and either shot or they would have killed them, but destroyed the Alamo without losing too many men. The heavy artillery was on its way up from Mexico. All he had to do was wait. But Santana, mark this down, wanted a dramatic victory. He wanted a big event. He had to show off. He's that sort of guy. He's that sort of character. And some of Santana's generals will say to him, El Presidente, just wait. Artillery will be here. And Santana replied back famously. He said, what are the lives of soldiers but that of chickens? So when it's all said and done and the soldados, those soldiers, those quote-unquote chickens, go over the walls on the pre-dawn hours of March 6, 1836, they're going to pay with their lives. Had they waited, they probably would have taken 100 casualties. They didn't wait because Santana had to have a victory, and a dramatic one at that, over these rebels, and he sent them over the walls on March 6, 1836. It was all said and done, put this in your notes, it cost the Mexicans approximately 700 men to sack the Alamo. Had they waited just 48 hours or so, it would have been much, much lower. And on top of that, there were no nurses to speak of. There were no doctors for these guys. Some of them were gutted, and they died 12 days later. It was brutal stuff. But even with all that to say, though, is on the night of March 5th, now the morning of March 6, 1836, it came really close to being one of those moments where you say, it's going to work out just fine for those soldados. And, of course, for Santana. Santana had ordered the bombardment to stop on the 5th. And, you know, in the scheme of things, you've all heard the expression, the calm before the storm. If you were a Texian in the Alamo and that bombardment had stopped that night, you had to figure something was up. Something big was getting ready to happen. They're coming. But the Texians, who were no soldiers, they were citizen soldiers, were tired. And they all fell asleep, basically. And the soldados were given the strict order, say nothing, say nothing, say nothing. Don't shout, don't chant, don't sing, don't do anything. Say nothing. And they start the assault. In the dark of the night, this is about 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:30 in the morning. The sun isn't up by any stretch. And these soldados are picking through the inky black night. Slowly but surely, they are taking their steps muffled, maybe a whisper here or there, but the tension, you could cut it with a knife. It was so tough that one of these soldados, some of whom were literally pulled out of the jails themselves, some of them were just rank criminals, others were good soldiers. It depends on who you're talking about. But some soldado, we don't know who, screams out in the middle of the night as they're approaching the walls of the Alamo, and the Texians are asleep. Viva Mexico! Viva Santana! And when he did that, the whole army answered in unison or in quick reply, Viva Santana, Viva Mexico. And they woke the Texians up, and the Texians lit into them. The rifle fire was hot at the Alamo on the morning of March 6, 1836. The cannon fire was even worse. If you could only imagine what a cut up horseshoe would do to somebody up close, because those are what's being belched out of those cannon at the Alamo, it's terrible carnage. The Texians were going to sell their lives, and they sold them dearly. In addition to that, not only do the Texians sell their lives very dearly, William Barrett Travis gives up the ghost within the first few minutes of the battle. He gets shot in the forehead and falls dead. Others die later. Others die in fallback positions. Even cats get shot after the fact. Probably the last person to be executed at the Alamo is David Crockett. The Mexicans just overwhelmed the defenders, and over the walls they came. And by 6:30 in the morning, the battle was effectively over. The Mexicans had the fort. The Mexicans had the Alamo. One of the last individuals to be executed is going to be David Crockett and a couple of his friends on orders of Santana. What's the significance of the Alamo? Well, I mean, it's one of the defining events of what it means to be a Texan. Even to this day, the Alamo engenders a lot of blood and heart palpitations. The thing, though, is, and this is where I want you to write down in your notes, what does it do for the Texas Revolution? What it does is that it sobers a lot of Anglo-Texians up. It sobers a lot of Anglo-Texians up. A lot of old Anglo-Texians who had said, we can stay true to Mexico. We are not part of that cabal. We're not part of Travis and the War Dogs. We're loyal to Mexico. But it became very clear by Santana's actions and words and deeds that there was no neutral course. There was no future, in a sense, in Mexico. It was either win or die, or win or run away. What it does cause is it causes the Anglos in Texas to unify. You get that dries up any peace efforts. It's either going to be run back to the United States or fight. Secondly, there were a few survivors. They were women and a slave, a couple of slaves. Excuse me, one slave. Those who survived went back and told the tale, one of which is Susanna Dickinson. And when word got out that the Alamo had been slaughtered and that the soldiers had been stacked up and burned, which was happened that day and the next day, what begins next in Texas history is what's called the runaway scrape. The runaway scrape. That's a Texian term for we ran like hell. For most civilians, they depopulated Gonzales. They depopulated Bastrop or Minna. They depopulated Beeson's Crossing and Burnham's Crossing. They depopulated Washington on the Brazos, and they are fleeing for their lives. They're fleeing to East Texas, fleeing to the United States.
When did this happen?
And basically, after the fall of the Alamo and the news gets out of the fall of the Alamo, so make it March 10th, March 12th in that territory, but as it goes through the rest of the month, 1836, same thing.
Okay.
So the thing is that in 1836, for the rest of March, and even into April, you see the Anglos, especially the Anglos of Texas, they are fleeing eastward, the runaway scrape. Gonzales is burned to the ground. In the meantime, by the way, and I'll just say this rather quickly, is that the Texas Declaration for Independence is signed on March 2nd, 1836, before the fall of the Alamo. But that's nice, but until you win battlefield victories, pieces of paper have some to no meaning. Now let's shift our focus now down south. Let's shift our focus down south toward the coast. And that brings us to the largest Texian command at this point in time. In February of 1836, where Travis could only muster not even 200 men at the Alamo, and just spent the last half hour talking about, down toward the coast there was a fellow named James Walker Fannin. James Walker Fannin, who is the commander of what we would sometimes call Goliad, or the Presidio at Goliad. They called it Fort Defiance. If you've ever seen a red flag with a white banner, it's really, to me, I like flags in a strange, I'm kind of a strange guy in that sense. I like flags. But one of the flags I probably ought to buy at some point is the Goliad Fort Defiance flag. It's this, and some of you might have seen it in a buddy's apartment. If you can, some of you've got Come and Take It. Some of you've got Don't Tread on Me, or something like that. You ought to get this one too. It's a red arm on a white banner, and the red arm is holding up a saber. And you can see these splurts of blood. It's a severed arm flag. We'd rather cut off our arm than lose our liberty, is their thinking. Fort Defiance. Goliad is frankly more important than the Alamo, because Goliad is defending the coast. And if the Texians are going to get supplies for this revolution, it's going to come from the United States, and they need supplies from the coast. But after the fall of the Alamo, on March 6, 1836, and about 3 or 4 days later, word reaches the ears of James W. Fannin at Goliad. Goliad's been flanked. William, who's in the Corps of Cadets, I don't know if you have to take military science yet. If you have, I don't know if they talk about flanking maneuvers and such just yet. Don't get flanked. Don't forget to put up the security. Don't get caught by surprise. Those sorts of basic things. James Walker Fannin is a bad officer. Start out with that statement right there. James Walker Fannin is a bad officer. He failed out of West Point about a decade before, after 2 years. But because he had been to West Point, people wanted to give him credit and say this man knew what he was doing. I would never let that man touch anything. In fact, actually, Fannin, earlier in the war, said to a buddy of his, Henry Smith, said, I don't know why you put me in this job. I don't know why I'm here. I don't have any abilities. Please get me out of here. And they didn't. They didn't. In fact, this is the quote I'd give you, too, from Sam Houston. Sam Houston said about James Fannin that he was, quote, an ill-fated man. An ill-fated man. As everything was headed south at the Alamo, Sam Houston, in charge of the Texian army at Gonzales, Sam Houston was in charge of like 100 men. He had no army. The biggest army, or the biggest force in the Texian army, was at Goliad. Houston, who is commander of the Texian army, orders Fannin to head to the Colorado River so they could meet up and join forces. It takes on more urgency when the Alamo falls because of that flanking of the Goliad, if you look at a map. But the fatal flaw for James W. Fannin was this, and I mean fatal, and I mean that literally now. The fatal flaw for James W. Fannin was he dithered. He was indecisive. He couldn't make up his mind. When he should have been pressing the proverbial gas, he should have been hurrying to pack up Goliad and get the hell out of town. Sorry to say it that way, but get moving. He dithered. He drug his feet. He waited. Things that should have not slowed him down, or cannon that should have been thrown into the San Antonio River and buried and spiked, he tried to drag it along with him. He tried to use wagons that didn't have properly cured axles, and so they got hot and burnt. All of which is to say is that James Walker Fannin, day after day, is going to waste time. And it's going to get 400 men killed. It's a disaster. It's a disaster in the making. The battle for Coleto Creek, or the Battle of Coleto Creek, let's call it that in your notes, the Battle of Coleto Creek. It's not a battle of Goliad or anything of that nature. Coleto Creek, I'll spell that for you in the chat sidebar. It's over there close to Victoria, kind of heading up Highway 77, or 59 territory, actually. The problem for Fannin wasn't that he was just slow and he dithered. He was also facing the best Mexican general in the field, and that man's name is Jose Urrea. Jose Urrea is a first-class officer. That man would have been good in anybody's army. However, Jose Urrea is also subordinate to Santa Anna, or Santana, whichever you prefer. Well, Urrea catches up with Fannin in the middle of an open field. And I think one person in this class did a paper on Jack Shackelford and the Alabama Red Rovers, which was attached to this outfit. The Texians got caught out in an open field, and there Fannin ordered his men to stop, to circle up in an open field and hope for the best. So what the first thing Urrea did was, he told his sharpshooters, General Urrea of the Mexican Army, said, shoot the horses, shoot the animals, not the men. Why? Because you can't move. You're pinned. Shackelford evidently had confronted Fannin when Fannin ordered the halt there in the middle of an open field. He said, for heaven's sakes, and I think he used stronger words than golly gee, but he said, we've got to get to this thicket. We've got to run. We've got to fly. The Texians were caught out in an open field. They got picked apart. Even Fannin got shot in the thigh that first day there on March 19th, 1836. Overnight, the Mexicans brought up their artillery pieces outside a rifle range, but close enough to do the deed. And the Mexicans on the morning of March 20th, 1836, fired a couple of shots into the Texian square, and the Texians got the picture. They were surrounded, and there's nothing more they can do. Fannin goes to meet with Urrea. Fannin comes back with surrender. Urrea told Fannin, surrender at discretion, but wink, nod, I'm not going to kill you. That's the kind of way I read it. Fannin told his men, surrender. We can surrender with honor, and we'll be sent home. That's not what happened, because on March 27th, 1836, the Texians, who were now back at Fort Defiance, a.k.a. Goliad, are going to be marched out on Palm Sunday in 4 different directions out of the Fort Defiance Goliad compound, and will be summarily executed. The last man in the Texian rebel outfit to be shot was Fannin himself. What ends up happening is that Fannin realized what he had done and how bad he'd messed up. And he said basically to his captors, his executors, would you please do 3 things for me? Shoot me in the chest, bury me in a Christian burial, and send my watch to my family back in Georgia, where he was from. His captors shot him in the face. They burned his body, and they stole his watch. What the massacre at Goliad on Palm Sunday, 1836, does is it takes the Texas Revolution, and put this in your notes now, turns it into a blood feud. I haven't really hit real hard on the idea of this blood feud business, and so I'm clear about this, I haven't really gone into as much detail as I would have liked. But many of those folks who had come to Texas, those Anglos who had come to Texas, they were descendants of the Scotch-Irish. And if you know anything about the Scotch-Irish, they can feud, and they can hate. And they hate Santana now. So when you get to San Jacinto on April 21st, 1836, and they are screaming, the Texians are screaming, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. There's a lot of bloodlust that's going to be brought out that day. So I think that's a good place to stop, actually, and I will just simply say this to you.